Hello. Welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. My name is Matt. Thank you for listening. Oftentimes, online, I'll stumble across one of those threads somewhere entitled something like, "What's the most mind-blowing historical fact you know?" Occasionally, there I'll see something totally new and exciting, but usually it's the same 5 or 6 answers. And I don't mean to disparage those threads. I'm glad people are having these discussions and talking about cool historical tidbits. And many people, normal people, people who don't spend as much time with their noses buried in history books as I do, can glean a lot of interesting stuff from them. They can learn and discover new topics about which they'd like to learn more, but once you've seen a couple of those threads, you've kind of seen them all. Yes, Cleopatra lived closer to the moon landing than the construction of the Great Sphinx in Egypt. And that's, kind of cool, but it really just stems from a misunderstanding or maybe a lack of understanding of world history. Because, human history is old. Really, really old. The Sphinx, which is far from the oldest relic of our past, is 4,500 years old, and Cleopatra lived just over 2,000 years ago. So, we still have almost 500 years to throw that little factoid around. And yes, that fact should be conditioned with a ton of terms like generally accepted and believed, but, it holds up. And again, I'm glad people are having those discussions. Someone who might not have the same understanding, who, might not have paid the best attention in history class, and I was occasionally guilty of that, can learn a fact like that somewhere randomly online and have their curiosity piqued. That can lead to a greater understanding of that topic and world history in general. Another similar fact that I often see is that Oxford University in England is older than the Aztec Empire, and this sort of mind-blowing fact stems from the same basic problem, a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding. The same factors that make it mind-blowing make the Cleopatra factoid mind-blowing. Sometimes when we hear about Cleopatra's Egypt or the Aztec Empire, some of us can tend to lump them in with all of ancient Egypt or all of pre-Columbian Mesoamerican society, and we shouldn't do that. Cleopatra's Egypt was a far different place from the Egypt of the ancient pharaohs, separated by thousands of years, but to many, they both merge into the mist of ancient history. And the Aztecs suffer a similar fate. They're relatively modern, like the 1400s. Johannes Gutenberg was out there kick-starting the European Renaissance with his printing press and his Bible at the same time that the Aztec Empire was reaching its height. But we see them, or, some of us do, in this monolithic way. And it was actually that little fact about Oxford University being older than the Aztecs that brought all of this on. I was reading about Oxford, trying to untangle all of the different colleges of which it's comprised, and how old they are, and what they do within the University of Oxford. That got me thinking about those threads and these mind-blowing facts, but the reason that I'm thinking about Oxford at all is because of one of our characters today. His name was Sir Henry Wotton, and he was a man who went to Oxford. Now, Sir Henry's story is not particularly interesting, at least not to me, except where it intersects our story of Barbary piracy, but we're going to be talking a fair bit about that aspect of it. Sir Henry was a well-born son, but he wasn't noble. He was a young man who went to the finest schools in England. He went to Winchester College, which was sort of a high school, with the motto, "Manners maketh the man," and then he followed that up by going to the New College at Oxford, and finally the Queen's College. Those were kind of undergrad and graduate studies. Sir Henry reminds me of the opening of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Robinson Crusoe, Defoe is discussing how his character, Robinson Crusoe, intends to go to sea when he reaches his manhood, but Robinson's father warns against this. He says of ocean-faring travel, quote, "It was for men of desperate fortunes on one hand, or of aspiring, superior fortunes on the other." And he continues, quote, "Mine was the middle state, or what might be called the upper station of low life, which he had found by long experience was the best state in the world, the most suited to human happiness." End quote. Now I'm just going to blow right past the fact that Daniel Defoe possibly the first and certainly one of the greatest English novelists of all time, almost certainly pulled that line about men of desperate fortunes straight from the same source that I named an episode after. I'll save that for later discussions of Alexander Selkirk and William Dampier and Daniel Defoe. But Sir Henry Wotton reminds me very much of that sentiment. His father was well off enough to send him to the finest schools, but left Henry only with a modest inheritance. We would probably consider him something like upper middle class. That education that he received, though, served him very well in his life. Sir Henry went into diplomacy as a career path. He served as a secretary to an earl who was, at the time, working in Poland as well as Italy and Germany. Now that earl, his employer, would later be executed for high treason against Queen Elizabeth, and that earl's other secretary, the senior secretary, was hanged along with him. So Sir Henry thought that it might be prudent for the time to leave English service. He worked on the continent for a while, but then he returned to Britain to work for the King of Scotland, James VI. So when King James VI of Scotland also became King James I of England, Sir Henry found himself well positioned. He became an ambassador for King James, or maybe he continued serving in his ambassadorial role, only now it was for England. He was on assignment in the year 1604 in the Holy Roman Empire when Sir Henry uttered the line for which he would be remembered forever. Quote, "An ambassador is an honest gentleman sent to lie abroad for the good of his country." End quote. This is episode 91, Honest Gentleman Sent to Lie. Sir Henry uttered that phrase in Bavaria, but he was on his way to Venice. King James had assigned Sir Henry to serve as the English ambassador to the Venetian Republic, and he would serve in that role for many years. It should have been a relatively easy job. The Doge of Venice, an elected official, a commander-in-chief similar to a modern president, well, the Doge was something of an ally of King James I. The Venetians had severed ties with England when Elizabeth was in power, but King James was a new monarch and the Stuarts brought on a new time. There was a lot of lucrative trade to be won by allying oneself, at least in a trade alliance, with England. Plus, at that time, Venice was at odds with the Vatican, and they found some commonality there with England as well as the Netherlands. They weren't a Protestant nation like England or the Netherlands, but they were more accepting of Protestantism than almost anywhere in Italy or the Holy Roman Empire, and they found that England and the Netherlands, Protestant states, were more willing to trade with a country that was at odds with the Vatican than, say, Spain. And we can see the building relationship between Venice and England in the numerous works of literature that the English produced about Venice after King James took the throne. The most famous example of this actually comes before James took the throne, The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare, but there were tons of others after James took the throne. Positive relations with Venice had become a national policy, and James, who was a famous patron of the arts, saw to it that the playwrights and poets in his country stoked the ego of the Venetians to no end. Eventually, the English trade interests conflicted with Dutch and Venetian trade interests, and then the 30 Years' War, and all of that would put a serious pressure on the relationship between England and Venice, but in 1604 they were trading partners and relatively friendly. So that should have been a cake job for a favored servant of King James, right? There might be a bit of building relations early on, but everybody was on board, so there were no difficult talks to have. But then, in 1605, a man named John Ward jumped ship from his naval service, stole a ship and then another, and made his way to Tunis, where he preyed primarily on Venetian shipping. He was an Englishman, an English pirate, and his raiding of the ships of Venice strained the relationship between Venice and England. It made the relationship between Sir Henry and the Doge of Venice much more contentious. And then John Ward captured the Rainiera Isodorina, and that changed everything. Sir Henry was called before the Doge, furious at the time, to answer for John Ward's crimes, and it seemed for a moment that he just might pay for those crimes right then and right there with his own head. But, you don't kill the ambassador. That's a bad policy. It's the sort of thing that starts wars. So Sir Henry was allowed to walk away from that meeting, but he had a serious need to find out everything that he could about the notorious arch-pirate, Jack Ward. Now, Sir Henry had a counterpart in England, the Venetian ambassador to King James. His name was Ambassador Zorzi Giustinian, and he was equally furious as the Doge, or at least he was as furious as the Doge and the Senate of Venice instructed him to be. Sir Henry didn't utter the phrase about an ambassador being an honest gentleman sent to lie about Giustinian, but he definitely thought that Giustinian fit the part. The Venetian ambassador, Zorzi Giustinian, is a much more interesting character to me than Henry Wotton is. At least, his official dispatches, which is where we know the most about him, seem to have a lot more flair and character than Wotton's did. Remember, Wotton was a Winchester man, and manners maketh the man. I wouldn't be surprised to find out that, as a boy, he was a Milford man, to be neither seen nor heard. You can always tell a Milford man. And that's not just a throwaway Arrested Development joke. In his role as a diplomat, Wotton strove to remove himself from the proceedings as much as possible. Not to say that he didn't do his job. He engaged the Doge and the Senate, and he wrote all of the dispatches necessary, but he tried to leave his personal opinions and attitudes out of it. He was a representative of the king and the council, and he took that role very seriously. He strove to be neither seen nor heard, except as a representative of the king. Giustinian was a lot more willing to put himself out there, to give his personal opinions on anything and everything. Perhaps this was simply a cultural difference between the English and Venetian people. Giustinian was vocal about all of his opinions about everything, including England itself, and none of his opinions about his now home country seemed to be very good. Historian George Bach writes in his biography of John Ward, Barbary Pirate, The Life and Crimes of John Ward, the most infamous privateer of his time, quote, "An appointment to the court of King James was not a plum. Viewed from the sun-drenched piazzi of imperial Venice, England was a cold, dimly lit, and barbarous land at the European periphery, its language as obscure as its arts and industry were rudimentary." Arriving in England in early 1607, Giustinian accepted his posting with good grace. Whatever his feelings for the English climate, not to mention the English diet, Giustinian from the start embraced his dual role as Venice's official representative and chief spy in this remote backwater, and he applied himself to local intrigue with gusto. End quote. And aside from the climate and their industry and their food, there was another topic about which Giustinian was particularly vitriolic in regard to England. Most of that didn't make it into his official documents, but Giustinian was appalled by English sexuality and sensuality. Not an overabundance of sensuality, a lack of it. But more than anything, Giustinian appeared to be disgusted by the seeming embrace of homosexuality in England, or at least the easing of social norms surrounding it. Remember, this was the England of Shakespeare, of cross-dressing on stage, of wild poetry and all kinds of debauch. Now, Giustinian would never see the England of King James' grandson, Charles II, the Merry Monarch, which was even less sexually inhibited than King James, and he certainly would never see the court of Louis XIV, which was another step above entirely. But the England of James I was still a lot of fun. James cared more for plays and parties and the hunt than he did for ruling, and it showed. Extramarital affairs had always been the norm, but at one time they had been something to keep secret and quiet. But they became the norm in England out in the open, and same-sex relationships between the nobility were accepted, as long as they were kept quiet and children were still produced by marriage. Now, all of this disgust and vitriol may have been just a ruse to cover Giustinian's own homosexuality. Or perhaps not. Reports show that while he may have condemned the lax morals that led to all of those extramarital affairs, well, he took advantage of that culture. He was a dusky, charming, young Italian in an England that was at the moment somewhat idolizing dusky young Italians. A noblewoman might go out to see a production of The Merchant of Venice and see herself as Portia, beautiful, wealthy, and wildly desired. And the closest analog she might find to any one of her 3 handsome suitors in the play was likely to be the Venetian ambassador. Reportedly, Giustinian was more than happy to take advantage of all that. He could speak Italian. He could serve the best Venetian delicacies to be found anywhere in England, and then he could woo these women with bad poetry and fine wine. And he did, but something about it seems almost grudging, almost as though he felt it were a responsibility to his homeland as the handsome young Italian representing Venice to engage all of these women. They were a diversion for him, to be sure, but not a diversion with which he was particularly happy. He seems to have liked the women of England only slightly more than the climate and food, but perhaps that was because he was more interested in their husbands. That might be the sort of thing that wouldn't even make it into a private journal, though. But perhaps he didn't begrudge these women the time spent on them because he was more interested in their husbands, but because he was more interested in his job. He focused on his job more than women or food or anything else in his life. He spent most of his time and his resources learning everything he could about this arch-pirate, John Ward. In fact, he may be the original source calling Ward an arch-pirate after the capture of the Soterina, and it's very much thanks to him that we have as much information as we do about John Ward. It seems very much that the Privy Council of King James would have been happy to send a squadron of ships or 2, take care of Jack Ward, and sweep all of this trouble under the rug. But then, every couple of weeks, Giustinian would arrive before the council with a new report about the crimes of Jack Ward. And unfortunately for the council, that became official record. It couldn't be swept away and dealt with quietly. What's more, Giustinian wasn't just complaining about this to the council, he was sending all of it back to Venice. George Bach again writes in Barbary Pirate, quote, Giustinian issued letters and diplomatic dispatches like a paper mill, a torrent of ink, paper, and sealing wax, end quote. Now, without all of those dispatches, most of them stemming from Giustinian, we would likely know much less about Jack Ward. Had not he captured the Rainiera e Soterina and turned himself into that arch-pirate, John Ward would probably have blended into the mist of pirates. But Ward did capture that Venetian giant. He did become the most infamous Englishman of his age, and he can serve as the first real English pirate of the Age of Sail. There were certainly other English pirates during the Age of Sail before Jack Ward, but none of them are as well known. None of them achieved the fame, the infamy of John Ward. There are probably better arguments to be made, but I think that Jack Ward captures the spirit of pirates and piracy better than anyone before him. He was someone who captured the imagination and who inspired stories. That's half of what a pirate is about. But remember that this story here in Barbary, including John Ward and Simon Danseker and Francis Verney, all of that is taking place long before any of the other pirates we've talked about, except for Drake. It took place 50 years before Henry Morgan or Francois l'Olonnais, and John Ward absolutely informed those later buccaneers, especially the English. Think about the allusions that we see in modern-day hip-hop to someone like Al Capone or Bugsy Malone or maybe Scarface, a fictionalized version of Capone. They were legends, but the gangster rappers of the early 90s especially seemed to idolize them. John Ward was much the same with later pirates. Maybe not to Al Capone levels, that would probably be Francis Drake, but, in the same game. But there is another major reason why we know as much as we do about John Ward. There are records from the Admiralty Court. See, when John Ward returned from capturing the Rainiera e Soterina, his men cashed out their shares. They were worth, from those Admiralty records, about £15 a share. At least 2 of the men who were involved in the Admiralty Court proceedings owned 5.5 shares each. That's about £83 sterling, and that's on top of whatever money they may have already stashed away. Those 2 men were named John Key and William Longcastle. Now, we've mentioned their trial before. They were both captains under Jack Ward, and those 5.5 shares, those 83 pounds sterling, well, that was a lot of money back in 1607. It was enough to feed a modest family for maybe 5 or 6 years. It was certainly enough to buy land, to start a life, to start a family, and to retire from piracy. And that's what John Key and William Longcastle intended to do. After the capture of Sodorina, they cashed out and booked passage back to England on board a merchantman called the Unicorn. And they weren't alone here. They sailed with Thomas Mitten, Walter Hancock, and probably 8 or 10 other unnamed crew members. I can't say that I fault them for this. It seems like a good time to leave. Now, all of these men may have been able to sneak in under the radar. Perhaps they'd bribe a few officials, but most of them could carry their money wherever they chose in England. It was easy to change your name in those days, especially if you weren't already tied to land and family. But that wasn't what happened. These pirates were found hiding off the Cornish coast in a small boat. Presumably, at the moment, they were planning their re-entry into England, but they were arrested and dragged off to the Admiralty. Strangely, these pirates were not tried for their association with the arch-pirate John Ward. Not officially, at least. It was certainly noted and added to the mountain of character evidence against the pirates, but it was not the charge for which they were on trial. That's mostly because any piracy that they may have allegedly committed under John Ward down in the Mediterranean would have been hard to prove. It would have been expensive and time-consuming and even potentially impossible to find witnesses on the Barbary coast that would testify against them. The Admiralty probably could have done it, but they didn't have to. Instead, they stuck to these pirates' very first act of piracy, an act that happened before any of them met John Ward and one for which there were already witnesses. A few years earlier, the merchant ship Ulysses sailed out of London with a mission of trade in the West Indies. Now, the Ulysses had no proper captain, but she was under the authority of the factor of a man named Mr. Howe. A factor was something of an accountant and a lawyer, a little bit more power than a secretary, but someone with the power of attorney. And it was typical to have one of these sort of representatives on board any merchant voyage. They had exceptional power in the name of the merchant in question. They decided where to sail and where to trade and what to trade. In many ways, they were the boss of even the ship's captain on most merchant vessels, but it was an exceptionally bad idea to leave an accountant in command of a sailing vessel, unless he had some prior expertise in that matter. Especially, if you're going across the Channel to France or the Netherlands, that's not that dangerous. But if you're taking them on a transatlantic voyage to the West Indies, you need experienced commanders and sailors. Almost immediately, the Ulysses started having trouble. There was tricky sailing immediately after leaving the strait. There were storms, and then there were serious issues with basic ship maintenance, something that this factor had no idea how to deal with. The factor was not a prideful or foolish man, however. He ordered the ship to turn around and to head back to England, to Plymouth on the southwestern tip. He realized that he wasn't the man to lead this ship. So in Plymouth they picked up 4 sailors, William Longcastle, William Taverner, John Moore, and a slave that belonged to William Longcastle. All 3 of them were adept seamen, and this factor decided to hire them on as the captain, first mate, and pilot, respectively. At face value, this was a smart move, and it seemed to pay off very quickly. As soon as they got out to sea, these 3 experienced sailors noticed additional problems on the Ulysses that would prevent the Atlantic crossing, or at least make it significantly more difficult. At least, that's what they told the factor. They told him that before they began the crossing, they would have to stop on the coast of Morocco at a seaport called Salé. At the port of Salé, the Ulysses met another English ship, the Susan. They hailed Susan and invited her to pull up alongside to share a banquet. Now, this wasn't uncommon behavior, especially in port between 2 ships of the same nation. Naturally, the master of the Susan, Captain Anthony Y., thought nothing of it. The crew of Susan came aboard Ulysses and sat down to a feast, complete with fresh meat, exotic fruit, and copious wine. During the feast, William Longcastle, the captain, along with his companions William Taverner and John Moore, slipped away from the table. Perhaps a couple of other men that they had talked into doing so did as well. It's notable that Captain Longcastle's slave did not slip away. Perhaps it would have been a giveaway. It would have been too obvious. He was more than likely serving table at the time. While the festivities were still going on below decks, these Plymouth sailors sneaked aboard the Susan, cut her free, and sailed off into the night. Longcastle and his fellow, now they were pirates, sailed out of the harbor without the alarm being raised, and would sail on to Tunis to join up with Jack Ward and take place in all of his exploits. But on board the Ulysses, the festivities were still going strong. I would love to see just how the discovery that the Susan was gone went on aboard the Ulysses. I imagine maybe a lone sailor going above board to relieve himself, only to find that his ship was, well, not there anymore. Maybe he raised the alarm, or maybe he quietly got word to Captain Y, but either way, I wish I could have been there for the long moments of searching the harbor, followed by the accusations that followed. Captain Y was most certainly not pleased, and he blamed the crew of Ulysses. The factor, who was the focus of most of the blame, turned to find Captain Longcastle to see exactly what he should do in this situation, but William Longcastle seemed to have gone missing, along with his two companions. Everyone knew immediately what happened, and the Ulysses actually carried those men around looking for Ulysses and eventually carried them back to England. But Captain Longcastle took the Susan all the way to Tunis. He gathered more crew there, including a corps of Janissary warriors, and went out on the account as a full-time pirate. Now, his exploits following the capture of the Susan were less well recorded, at least until after the capture of the Rainieri Soterina. That's when he cashed out, sailed for England, and got himself arrested for high seas piracy. Now, had he gone about it properly, it's still very possible that he could have made it into England unnoticed. But considering how he did so, I tend to think of his decision to sail to England in a stolen ship and apparently using his real name, I tend to think of that as a really dumb decision. But remember, this was the first generation of major pirates operating in the Age of Sail. There wasn't really any institutional memory here. No pirates knew what would happen to them if they tried to go back to England. They could assume, of course, but privateers, and most of these men had previously been privateers, rarely faced any real consequences. Most of these men may have expected the same sort of reception. And then, Captain Longcastle didn't commit any piracy in or around England. He captured the Susan, an English ship, but that was all the way down in Morocco. I mean, who's going to remember that anyway? And he committed acts against the ships of other nations, but rarely from England, and always far away from English shores, so he assumed, I think, that he was in the clear. The problem here, with this particular brand of out-and-out piracy being so new, at least to the English and the Dutch, is that there wasn't anyone there to teach them better, that institutional memory. There were no old, grizzled, haggard, out-of-work pirates drinking away their days at the bar and telling old tales, in many cases cautionary tales. There was no one to hear them talking about their plans to return to England and say something along the lines of, "Going back to England, huh? Yeah, I know a fellow went back to England. Good man, good pirate. Name of Longcastle it was. Saved my ship, my men more than a few times, out there, on the blue. But he cashed out, retired from the life, planned to go start a family, back in England. We all wished him luck. Man never even made it to shore. They found him and hauled his whole crew away. But he was clever, Longcastle was, had a plan, always had a plan. When they found him, Longcastle had a man made his way to Cornwall, deep inland, deep cover. He found the merchant captain, the fat one, name of Y if I remember right. He was going to testify. And this man, he didn't kill Y, no, that was too dirty, too many fingers to point. This pirate, he paid Y off. The cost of one of his ships, the one that Longcastle commandeered, and then he paid him a whole heap of coins to make sure that Mr. Y forgot all about it. And that's exactly what happened. Probably, at least. Mr. Y, the primary witness, never showed up at the Admiralty Court to testify against Longcastle or any of his men. The generally accepted explanation here is that Longcastle paid him off. But I kind of like this storyteller, this hypothetical man in a bar telling tales. Maybe we'll call him Captain Exposition. He could go on in that dingy seaside bar. Yeah, Longcastle was clever. Even read books sometimes, knew a little Roman talk. Liked to sit down and think about things till he figured out a course. He thought he'd figured this one out too. Thought he'd walk free. But the court, they're always one step ahead. They brought out his man, a slave he got over in Plymouth that he had to abandon years ago. Everything he saw, every detail of every last crime. Longcastle said to him, you couldn't trust one of those dark-skinned heathens. But that was his mistake. He trapped himself. Longcastle was there when his man was baptized. They had the church records to prove it. Like I says, one step ahead. So they took Longcastle to the docks, him and all his men, all of them friends of mine. And there they strung him up, hanged him and left him there for a week, as a warning to men like me and men like you. Now, Captain Exposition here is exceptionally well informed for a dockside drunk. I don't know how he learned the ins and outs of Captain Longcastle's court appearance. However, later pirates in the decades to come would have characters similar to that sitting around. Older pirates, veterans who had seen everything. They had the usual rung of fantastical tales to tell, as well as the battle stories. But these old buccaneers had more utilitarian tales to tell. Those stories were how young and foolish pirates who were new to the game learned just what to do and what not to do. For example, these old pirates might tell stories about dangerous waters that usually had a heavy Spanish presence. It was a warning. Or they might tell tales about certain less-than-chaste women who would make one night very fun, but make the following weeks quite torturous. There were tales of bartenders who watered down drinks, and then they would almost certainly have a warning for anyone planning to sail back to England. It was almost always a bad idea. Longcastle, Key, and all of their friends, well, they didn't have anyone like that. However, anyone who thought to follow them to England would have had someone like that. See, everyone on Barbary learned about the death of Longcastle. And it wasn't just rumor spreading or even news that brought them word of Longcastle. It was official policy. King James I had agents operating in Barbary. Most prominent among them was Henry Pepwell. They were, well, some of them were spies who were sent to integrate themselves into the pirate ranks. And then there were more traditional intelligence officers tasked with gathering intel on Ward and his compatriots. Most of that intel was gained from the spies within Ward's ranks. There were occasional plans set down by some of these men, including Pepwell, to harm the operations of the pirates, but they never materialized. We're going to talk about one specific example of that next time. Instead, Pepwell and his compatriots were there to learn as much as they could until an all-out military campaign could be raised to deal with the pirates. But since they were unable to engage the pirates violently or even secretively, they engaged with another weapon, propaganda. And Pepwell wasn't alone here. All of his compatriots from England were doing it, as well as the Venetian Senate, who had their own agents there. There were agents of the Doge as well, and there were additional agents sent by Zorzi Giustinian and Henry Wotton, the two ambassadors from England and Venice. That's to say nothing of the French or the Spanish or the Dutch, who had their own people operating there. But those ambassadors, the English and Venetian, proclaimed the death of Longcastle from the rooftops. They proclaimed it in the city squares and handed it out in written form, in English and Venetian and Arabic and Turkish. They let everyone that was there know that Longcastle and Key and all of their associates were dead men. This was intended, in part, perhaps, to turn the people of Barbary against the pirates, to show the craftsmen and farmers that these men were criminals, not friends. But more than that, it was intended for the eyes and the ears of the pirates, to scare them, to intimidate them, and to remind them that justice was coming. And on one level, at least, it really seems to have worked. Around this time, a little bit later, but around this time, John Ward got Rainiera y Soderina outfitted as a proper man-of-war and got her ready to set sail. His men were feeling comfortable and protected and powerful. Mostly, those that hadn't cashed out were staying put. A few may have gone over to Danziger while he was refitting the Rainiera y Soderina, but once he got it under sail, even more came to join his ranks. On the other hand, the man himself, the admiral, the arch-pirate, John Ward, well, he seems to have been hedging his bets. What happened here with a broad brush is Ward sent a messenger back to England, perhaps several messengers, sometime after the execution of his former followers. Later evidence will suggest that he had agents of his own operating in England and Venice. He knew a surprising amount about the mood and the activities in the royal courts there. So he didn't have to get men to the king, only get men to the coast to meet his men who were living in England already. Men who could prove that they had not operated as pirates in the Mediterranean. What these messengers were seeking was pardon. Specifically a pardon for John Ward, but also a general pardon for the English pirates operating in Barbary. All of them if possible, but at least those operating under Ward. Ward wanted a proclamation that would declare any of them wayward privateers rather than pirates. Sure, maybe they would face a fine or maybe even a short sentence, but not life imprisonment and absolutely not execution. Now, most historians agree, and their argument has merit, the dates seem to line up best here. They agree that Ward sent this missive off after he heard about Longcastle and Key and their execution. Perhaps he didn't want that to be the end to his life, and perhaps he wanted to secure a peaceful end to his life. However, not all historians agree that that's exactly what happened. But really, it's kind of a non-issue. Even if that were the case, even if he did send it off immediately after receiving word about his friends being hanged, King James wouldn't receive this word until after the events that we're going to discuss next time. Or at least King James was unable to reach a decision until after those events reached England. His response, therefore, was tempered by them. So we're going to wait on that response until next week. We're going to continue our discussion of the ambassadors, Giustinian and Wotton, who played a major role, as well as the roles of the Doge of Venice, King James of England, and John Ward the pirate. Last time, we talked about the English ambassador to Venice and the Venetian ambassador to England, Henry Wotton and Zorzi Giustinian, respectively. Today's episode is going to be almost a direct continuation of last time. We're going to continue our story of Wotton and Giustinian. We're going to throw in a dash of Henry Pepwell, the king's man in Barbary, and we're going to tie in John Ward and the pirates of Barbary on a much more concrete level. The reason I wanted to talk about these two men at all, Wotton and Giustinian, is because their documents, along with the Admiralty Court, are the best sources we have on John Ward. There are a number of others, which we've used on this show, pamphlets, plays, and poems, all about Ward, but all of those are, at best, secondary sources. They attempt to tell a complete narrative, and they may have had access to sources that we don't, but they aren't perfect. The ambassadors, Wotton and Giustinian, they really only got involved after the capture of the Rainiera y Soderina. But then they got really involved. It was a contentious time between them, when a breakdown of diplomatic relations seemed imminent. Both of them talked openly, at least to their governments, about the possibility of war. And that potential war was due almost entirely to the piracy of John Ward. See, in the opinion of Zorzi Giustinian, Ward was not an anomaly in English society. He was a natural product of it. Giustinian considered the English a nation of pirates. Those that weren't pirates were either lowly peasants who had no effect on society, or they were direct profiteers in English piracy. And Giustinian was far from the first to suggest this. The Spanish called Queen Elizabeth the Pirate King, due to her policy of employing privateers. Now, in Elizabeth's eyes, that was legal, and it was in England, but basically no one else in Europe agreed with her. The Spanish, her greatest enemy, considered Sir Francis Drake you might consider her champion on the high seas. They considered Drake the worst pirate ever to sail. And they were going to continue to. Whenever Henry Morgan or Black Bart Roberts or any other English pirate would attack Spanish possessions, it only served as further evidence in the eyes of the Spanish that the English were all pirates. Now, that narrative struggled whenever the Dutch or the French were ascendant in the pirate game, when they were a bigger threat than the English. And Giustinian had the same problems. In the case of the Spanish, and as we're going to see in the case of Giustinian, it was a lot like many modern opinions about foreign peoples, or, maybe even better, about wild conspiracy theories. Whenever someone, in this case someone like Giustinian, or whenever a whole nation holds a certain opinion very strongly, any evidence that supports that opinion will be embraced, while any evidence that conflicts it will be tossed aside. No, I'm not trying to be controversial here, but we've all heard opinions or theories that we find absolutely impossible, utter nonsense. Of course, your mileage may vary, depending on your point of view of what is absolutely impossible nonsense. You could look at an older example, a classic example, something like the Roswell aliens, Area 51. Those theories can range from the absolutely insane to the almost plausible. The sort of theories where you can find a nugget of truth. And in a lot of ways, that's similar to Giustinian's views on the English and piracy. He really did see this vast conspiracy between the English people, who were all pirates, and the nobility, who all profited and protected the pirates. And he wasn't really wrong here. For decades, the English had been employing privateers, and rich nobles had financed many of those privateers for a cut of the take. The future will see scores of pirates who were either commissioned or protected, or at the very least forgiven, in the case of someone like Henry Morgan, and then rewarded because the damage they did created a suitably unstable environment. It was an environment that those nobles could exploit to grab up land and make a huge amount of money. And it wasn't just the nobility. Admiralty officials, the actual admirals were usually nobility, but most of the bureaucracy were not. And then there were dockmasters and magistrates, and they were all too often all too willing to look the other way if the price was right. They would allow goods to be brought into England or Port Royal or Nassau before it was a pirate republic, so they could be fenced there, and oftentimes it wasn't just goods, it was the pirates themselves. We know all about the captains and the famous names that make up the story of piracy, and very few of those stories end happily. But how many pirates made good? How many names do we not know because they made a killing on one voyage, settled down with their earnings, and bought land in Jamaica or maybe South Carolina? How much wealth was transferred via piracy, illegally, from Spain or Venice or any other nation to enrich England and her people? And aside from a few very high-profile examples, we don't really know. The popular image, the generally agreed-upon image of a pirate is somebody who drank and gambled away their money, who spent it on women and foolish clothes, and that was often true, but how many pirates were smarter than that? How many pirates left the pirating life when they had the chance to start a real life? It may be more than we think. But it kind of reminds me of how there are a few very powerful families here in the U.S. that made their money through deals with Nazi Germany or maybe bootlegging. Now those families are respectable, admired, powerful people, but they got their start through very illegal means. In Be More Pirate, Sam Conniff-Allende quotes Bernard Williams saying, quote, "The average man will bristle if you say his father was dishonest, but he will brag a little if he discovers that his great-grandfather was a pirate." End quote. I really dig that quote. The point I'm trying to make here is that Zorzi Giustinian wasn't necessarily entirely wrong. The English were profiting off piracy, and they would continue to do so for the next century and a half at least. And Giustinian took that truth, and he took it, well, I've been talking about the reality of it, but I think he took it a little too far. He took it from that nugget of truth we might find about communist spies and the Area 51 conspiracies to a place that most people couldn't follow. places where the evidence worked against him. Much like those conspiracy theorists, he was unwilling to accept any information that might contradict or discredit his theory. And Giustinian saw evidence to support his theory everywhere, even when it wasn't really there. So Giustinian's communiques, his letters and reports back to Venice, are something of a minefield. We have to walk very carefully while reading them because oftentimes we will find what we need, but oftentimes we will be presented with something that is absolutely impossible. But if we look at the bones of his theory, John Ward, the arch-pirate, was English, and some Englishmen were almost certainly profiting from that piracy. We're going to find that nugget of truth. In some ways, that will vindicate the beliefs of Zorzi Giustinian, until his entire theory was shaken and nearly shattered by one cataclysmic event. This is episode 92, Impending Peril. In October of 1607, King James I of England received an official petition for formal pardon from the pirate John Ward. This date, October 1607, is the crux around which much of our story today is going to focus. It's going to bring into question how much any of the players involved in this story knew at any given time. How much did King James I know? Well, personally, he knew very little usually, but how much did his advisors know? How much did Giustinian know? Usually more than he let on, but almost certainly less than he himself believed he knew. How much did Wotton know? Usually not very much. He was a poor diplomat. Or he was a fine diplomat, but he was a poor spy. Or at least he didn't care to employ spies, which is a large part of what this question, this crux of October 1607, revolves around. In a lot of ways, it's a lot like the Cold War. You know, the story of East and West Berlin, spies giving, receiving, and sharing their information before anybody would officially recognize that it had been shared or learned. You lose the advantage once you admit that. And how much did John Ward know? Now, of course, in the case of John Ward, we don't have mountains of communiques that he sent off to the Doge or the King or the Privy Council or the Senate. We only have a very few pieces of second-hand information about what he may or may not have known, but those pieces of information suggest that he knew significantly more than anybody back in Europe would have expected. And the problem here, especially in the case of Giustinian, is how he appeared on occasion to have information, at least to be acting on information, before anyone should have had access to it. You know, news traveled slowly in the early 1600s. Traveling by ship, a ship might bring in information that they had picked up along their voyage, but even with that, you had to be unsure about the validity of the information. Perhaps you had to wait for confirmation, which might take days or weeks, which might be why the king and council seemed to be so much less well-informed. An ambassador could make recommendations based upon rumor, but a king or a doge could not take direct action without at least 2 or 3 pieces of corroborating evidence. So let's step back a few months from October 1607 to July 1607, when a ship arrived at the dock of London. That ship bore an Ottoman official. From G.B. Harrison's A Second Jacobean Journal, being a record of those things most talked about in the years 1607 to 1610, this Ottoman ambassador's name was Mustafa. Now, Harrison described Mustafa and his retinue. There were a few janissaries in the retinue, along with a number of, quote, Turks, whereof 3 only are decently apparelled, the rest looking like the ambassadors that came to Joshua with old shoes and threadbare apparel, end quote. And then Harrison goes on to say that Mustafa himself, quote, hath many changes of garments, very rich, and several turbans, end quote. Now, Mustafa was an Ottoman official, but more specifically, he was a messenger from the coast of Barbary. He seems to have been a secretary to either Pasha Redwan of Algiers or of Murat Rais, the naval official in the city of Algiers. Now, careful listeners to the show might say, hey, I thought Szymon Danziger was the admiral of Algiers, and that's true. And actually, Murat Rais may actually have been Szymon Danziger. Perhaps he was using an alias, and later, Danziger would be known by a Turkish name. However, it's equally probable that this wasn't Danziger. Murat Rais was probably just a high-up galley commander in Algiers, perhaps an equal or very, very nearly equal subordinate to Danziger. Either way, this Ottoman official, Mustafa, carried letters of introduction from the Pasha, Redouan, and from Murat Rais to King James. Now, Mustafa requested an audience with the king and with the council, but he was mostly ignored. He wasn't an ambassador, per se. He certainly wasn't the Ottoman ambassador from Istanbul, and he wasn't even an ambassador from Jerusalem or Alexandria. He was the secretary of a second-rate pasha known to conspire with pirates. This sort of messenger wasn't uncommon, of course. James was a new king in England, 3 years on the throne only, and by that point nearly every king or queen or emperor or doge or sultan that the world had to offer, or, at least the world that had any dealings with England, well, they would have sent a formal introduction with a proper ambassador. But after that would come the turn of the dukes and barons and senates and parliaments and councils. Lesser governing bodies and nobles from all over Europe, they would all send representatives to the king as well. That would take longer, significantly longer than it had taken for the ambassadors of every monarch in Europe to reach King James, but a couple of years is plenty of time. Then, lesser nobility, as well as any governor or any mayor that thought it might be useful to have some official contact with the King of England, began to send their own letters to King James I. Most of these messengers were politely received by one of the king's underlings, someone with virtually no power. They were thanked by said underling, given a few nights' food and rest, and then sent packing back home. And that wasn't rude. I mean, does the President of the United States have time to meet with every mayor in America? Of course not. You'd almost be concerned if he was doing so with what he was spending his time on, right? Now, the president is likely to shake hands with the mayor whenever he visits a town, and the king would almost always meet the local lord, but certainly not every emissary from every small-time official that came to London. And that's what those letters of introduction were about. Some secretary, some undersecretary, would read that letter, and if it had any importance, say the governor in question was, the Sultan's nephew, or perhaps it was a strategically important location on the continent, then that undersecretary might bring it before the council. But if not, that undersecretary would just file it away. If, in the future, that place or person somehow became important, they would have that letter of introduction indexed and be able to pull it out. However, this Ottoman official from Barbary wasn't like a messenger sent from the mayor of some Bavarian town. There were pirates there in Barbary. They were a problem for the entire Mediterranean, and Barbary was a place of great strategic importance to anybody who had an interest in Mediterranean trade. So this messenger was a little more important than the norm. Not so much that the king or even the council really would waste time on him, but he was given a temporary residence in London, something that would last a lot longer than room and board for a few days. He was also given a stipend on which to live, and then he was told to wait. Now, Mustafa was treated much the same way in France, and it appears that he was actually quite happy to live this life. A free house, free money, and plenty of entertainment. See, Mustafa was feasted and feted all across London, all across England. He was, reportedly, quite handsome. He was charming, and he was exotic. He was a very popular man in the court of King James for the time that he spent in England. Not popular with James himself, of course, but with many of the nobility that surrounded the king. Part of his popularity came from the tales he would tell, tales of great deeds done in the Ottoman Empire and the Barbary coast, tales of mythology that were common in the Islamic world. But what received the most attention of all of his stories was of his meeting with Captain John Ward. See, Mustafa traveled around Barbary for some time alongside the French ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. He was there to show the French ambassador around. That French ambassador, along with Mustafa, were visiting the city of Tunis at the same time that John Ward was still outfitting Rainieri Soderini, and they met with the corsair. The French ambassador was, at least possibly, specifically there to meet with Jack Ward. You see, the French had always been immune from any Ottoman piracy. The Franco-Ottoman alliance was still in effect, and the French ambassador wanted to secure the favorable protection that they had once had. He wanted to ensure that French shipping would be safe from any pirates operating out of any Ottoman Barbary city-state. Now that should have been a relatively simple piece of diplomacy. In any other time it would have been a bag of coins in the right hands, and all of a sudden you have nothing left to worry about. But when he brought up that possibility to Jack Ward, the pirate responded to him, incredulous at even being asked, quote, "I, favorable to the French? I tell you, if I should meet my own father at sea, I should rob him and sell him when I had done." End quote. So that didn't go over. But even though the Frenchman had been rebuffed, the Ottoman, there in Tunis, Mustafa, was planning a trip to England, the homeland of Jack Ward. So Mustafa asked Jack Ward if Ward would like Mustafa to see if he could secure a pardon from the King of England. Ward's reply seems to have been a bit less vitriolic, but still negative. He said, quote, that he would never see England again, but he would be buried in the sea. End quote. Now this story reached England at the very earliest in July 1607. That was when Mustafa arrived in London. However, just a few months later in October, we would find out that John Ward was seeking that official pardon. So, what's the deal with Mustafa's story here? Was he lying? Was he just not telling the truth? Perhaps. He may have been weaving a tale that would delight and shock his listeners with this callous, fierce, uncaring pirate Jack Ward. Or perhaps John Ward was playing some sort of devilish and intricate game with his men and Mustafa and King James himself, a game to which only he knew the outcome. Or then, it's possible that in the time it took Mustafa to go from Barbary to England, and remember he spent time in France and visited with all sorts of the nobility there as well, so it took him a while, but perhaps in the time it took him to get to London, something had happened, something that gave John Ward a change of heart. And right there is where the timeline starts to get all screwy. If that were what happened, and there is an obvious event coming up to make John Ward change his mind, it would make sense, but it doesn't quite fit the timeline. Regardless, some historians still believe that due to some of these questions of spies and how long it took official communications to move, that might actually be what happened here. But more on that later. Let's look at the first two options. First, it is entirely possible that Mustafa was just spinning a yarn, and John Ward never said any of those things. That would be a very easy answer. It would explain quite a bit. Mustafa arrived in July, word of John Ward's request for pardon in October. So if he were lying, it seems that, however exciting his tales may have been to the people of London, John Ward just blew a hole in it. However, as easy as that answer is, we can't verify it. We can't prove that he was lying here, so we have to operate off of the assumption that Mustafa was telling the truth, and that Jack Ward really told him that he never intended to see England. So let's look at the second option, the possibility that John Ward was spinning that web of deception. Author Greg Bach writes in his book Barbary Pirate, quote, "Whatever the true nature of Mustafa's mission, he had unwittingly become the pawn of a more subtle player. John Ward had relied on this garrulous charlatan to spread word of his publicly declared intention to live out his days in Tunis and be buried in the sea. In secret, however, Ward had matured a plan to negotiate the purchase of a royal pardon from James." End quote. We've talked before about John Ward's declarations upon receipt of the Soldierina that he was the master of the seas and of his belief that no navy would dare stand against his new warship. And if that were true, if John Ward actually held those beliefs, why would he be seeking pardon now? There are some potential reasons, maybe he was homesick. He still had a wife living in England after all. He might just want to die by her side, in his home country. That's a reasonable assumption to make about any person. However, Zorzi Giustinian's conspiracy theories begin to pick up steam here and contradict that possibility. See, he actually received a copy of John Ward's request for pardon on his desk. It was his right as the Venetian ambassador. He was personally engaged in all of the business with John Ward, so he didn't even have to ask for it. But he didn't like anything about this request for pardon. Regardless of his opinions, though, that pardon request was working its way up the chain of command in the Admiralty. Now, naturally, King James could have just granted it. He was the king, after all, but he was wise enough, or at least he was weak enough, to put the request for pardon through the rungs of diplomacy in the government body that dealt with ships and the sea, and pirates. And, perhaps shockingly, most of the Admiralty seemed to support it. Giustinian's belief, and he was probably right here, was that the Admiralty planned to agree to the pardon. They planned to allow Ward and his men back into England. In return, though, each man, from Ward on down, would have to pay a hefty fine, amounting to a significant percentage of their stolen wealth. The Admiralty would allow them in and then gather all necessary information pertaining to their crimes, including the prizes captured and how many shares each man was owed, and then the Admiralty would have them pay back a percentage of those shares. But, and this is a big but here, these pirates wouldn't be paying those fines to the injured parties, to the ship owners or those enslaved. They would be paying those fines, that retribution money, to the English Admiralty. Say John Ward and his men captured a Venetian ship. They took all of the cargo on board, as well as the entire crew prisoner. They stole the ship, sold all the men into slavery, and then all of the profit made on all of those ventures would not go to the Venetians, not to those enslaved. It would go to a few rich people back in England. And in a, sort of greedy, mercenary way, it makes sense. See, the Admiralty hadn't been receiving all of the income that they once had. A huge percent of the Admiralty's budget under Queen Elizabeth had come from privateering. In fact, most of it had. Elizabeth never spent her own money on the Admiralty. Not really. She would graciously accept everything that the privateers owed to her, the monarch, and then the Admiralty would go ahead and get most of it. That's how it worked in theory. In actual fact, the Admiralty was the body responsible for deciding just how much the privateers owed and collecting it. So, in theory, the Admiralty collected all of the money, gave it to their monarch, and then she paid the Admiralty their due. But in point of fact, the Admiralty just decided how much they were owed and collected the money, and then gave Elizabeth a percentage of that. That was a simple system that kept everyone moving through in a timely manner. It made everybody happy, it made everybody money, and it kept Elizabeth as the most powerful and most respected and most loved person in England, without her actually having to do anything aside from occasionally collect some money. It was perfect. But then King James outlawed privateering. Hence all of the pirate problems that the Admiralty suddenly had to deal with. In essence, what James did here was massively cut the budget of the Admiralty while giving them an endless number of headaches that they had to deal with. So you might not be surprised to learn that, later on, many within the Admiralty, in fact the majority, at one point, sided with the rebels in the Civil War. Now, James did up the budget that the Admiralty actually received from the Crown, but that's from virtually nothing to very, very little. It was pennies compared to what they had been getting from the privateers. So when James sent this request for pardon across the decks of the officials at the Admiralty, they all realized that they might just be able to have a little taste of the old days, to get some of that sweet, sweet foreign money. But then, of course, it didn't belong to them. It was mostly Venetian, with bits of Spanish and French and even Ottoman loot sprinkled in, among others. So why should the English get this windfall when almost none of the money actually belonged to them? That was the question that Giustinian wanted answered. When he received that request for pardon from John Ward, let's for a moment overlook Venetian honor, his own personal honor, the need of the Venetian people to get their loved ones back from the slavery into which they had been sold. Let's overlook all of those things, which this pardon did as well, and just look at the money. It's absolutely unacceptable in the eyes of anyone from Venice, especially the ambassador. So he wrote back to Venice about this pardon, to the Doge and the Senate, and he told them all about this plan that was being cooked up. And that was when he began to loudly, vociferously, attack England as a nation of pirates. He wrote at length about their plans and the network of bribery that pervaded the English government. He wrote, quote, "The king is so devoted to the chase," and when he says the chase here, he probably means the hunt, at least at face value, but he also may be alluding to King James' many affairs. "The king is so devoted to the chase that he leaves all to his counselors. The power of the Privy Council was never greater than now, by reason of the king's carelessness of rule. The council dealeth with all things, not only affairs of state, but money and also justice, so that whoso would attain anything, he must be protected by the lords of the council, and that by means of presents and gifts." And he goes on, quote, "These gifts they take not only from the subject, but as well from strangers and ambassadors and princes, which breeds a great hatred for these lords. Of the lords of the council, the greatest is Sir Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, Secretary of State, whose authority is so absolute that he may be called king indeed." End quote. We've talked about Cecil before, in the lead-up to the English Civil War and the 30 Years' War in particular. He was almost certainly the most powerful man in England, but Giustinian conceded that there was another man of perhaps equal importance in England when it came to dealings with Ward, a man named Charles Howard Effingham, 1st Earl of Nottingham and Lord High Admiral of England. Effingham had a long and distinguished career. He had shared power with Admiral Francis Drake during the invasion of the Spanish Armada, but after the invasion, when Drake had gone on the offensive, back to privateering essentially, Effingham had been promoted to Lord High Admiral, and that made him officially Drake's boss. And that was still the role he served in, the most powerful naval role in England. And remember, there still wasn't a Royal Navy of England. King James had his own private navy, of which he was commander, but so did Effingham, and Effingham's navy was significantly larger. Many of the Lord Admirals had their own navies, but Effingham's eclipsed all of them. That's what made him the most powerful naval official in England. Cecil, the most powerful man in England, typically deferred to Effingham on any matter that pertained to the sea. Thus, so did the king. And now, Effingham was pushing to accept Jack Ward's request for a pardon. Now, King James, or, in reality, Lord Cecil, was no fool here. This went beyond typical admiralty business. This was something that could potentially affect international relations. He couldn't just sign off on this as he would most things that Effingham suggested. So before agreeing to anything, Cecil sent off word to Henry Wotton, the English ambassador in Venice. Wotton was to go before the Doge of Venice and the Senate, and he was to present to them the potential pardon of Jack Ward. Now, he wasn't to be an idiot about it, of course. He was to use hints. He was to make suggestions about the possibility of a pardon, and to imply, but by no means to make anything even resembling a promise to which England could be held, that the Venetian Republic could receive a sizable payment for the return of Jack Ward. And here's where the conspiratorial nature of Zorzi Giustinian and reality begin to come into conflict. It was common sense for Wotton not to broach the subject of John Ward's pardon directly. It was really just how business was done. See, if the pardon was directly rejected by Venice, then King and Council would have an out. They'd be protected. They hadn't actually told their ambassador to say anything about this. Of course not. They had no intentions of pardoning Ward. The ambassador was just being an industrious agent who merely heard about the possibility and brought it before you on his own merit. And of course he's not to make any direct mention of recompense. First of all, that would just be crude, but second of all, anything that he said could potentially harm any future discussions that might be had about exactly how much Venice was owed. Now, Wotton did as asked, but Wotton was not a clever or subtle player of this game. Even worse, because of his counterpart's many letters insisting upon the dishonest, criminal, and piratical nature of all Englishmen, the Doge and the Senate, well, they believed that Wotton was hedging and lying. They believed that they would receive no payments at all. They had an attitude sort of like, "Can you guys believe how stupid he thinks we all are?" So the Venetians countered. They said that they would only consent to the pardon of Jack Ward if Venice received, the full cost of all men, ships, and cargo that had been lost at sea. In addition, they required a payment for damages to use in rescuing their enslaved countrymen, and then they required a compensation for all of the work that they were going to have to do in that regard. That's a lot of money. And they said that they were unwilling to budge on any of it. That's impossible. That's an impossible demand. Ward certainly didn't have that kind of money, not equal to everything he'd taken. All his wealth, all the wealth of his men, all of that combined, well, that wouldn't even come close to everything that had been taken from the Venetians. Remember, they all spent a lot of it. They all gambled a lot of it away, drank a lot of it away, spent it on women. And some of them, as discussed earlier, may have settled down there in Tunis. So any of those shares for the people who didn't want to accept this pardon, well, that's just automatically out. As I said, it's impossible. That money just didn't exist, not at that level. And even if it did, John Ward would never have consented to anything like that. And even if he did, let's pretend that he did have all that money and he was willing to pay all of that money back to Venice just to get back into England. Then there's the extra money. The damages that would be required. The extra fee for all of the work required. England would have to cover that. The admiralty in particular. It was just a non-starter. They'd essentially said no. If you can give us this, we'll take it, but we know you can't give it to us. And that was on purpose. Venice had no intention of allowing John Ward to go free. See, they had already assembled a fleet of dozens of giant Venetian warships. They were all equal to, or in some cases larger than, the Rainiera e Soderini, and every last one of them was intended for war, built for war. It wasn't just some refitted merchantman like the Soderini. This was a fleet built to kill a pirate. They wanted Ward dead. So John Wotton, having received this information, hung his head and left. And then, on the next day, 15 November 1607, Wotton returned to the Senate. Perhaps all of his dancing around the subject with hints and suggestions had backfired on him. It had, and that's actually a good thought on his part. I give him some credit for it, but he took that idea the wrong way. He got a lot more direct about the whole, look, you guys are still going to get some money thing, but he was still vague about it. And the Senate was displeased. He was wasting their valuable time. They'd told him they were unwilling to budge. At some point, they may have been willing to budge, even accept the pardon of John Ward had the payment seemed fair. But Wotton had lost their trust, and now, coming back to them, he seemed like a con man, and what's worse, a con man who had no respect for their intelligence. And then they dropped a bombshell on the ambassador. Everything that Wotton had presented relied upon John Ward waiting for this pardon, and they told the ambassador that Jack Ward wasn't even in Tunis anymore. Wotton's information was out of date. Not only was it out of date, it appeared to be a lie. See, if Jack Ward was indeed seeking a pardon from the King of England, then why had word of the Rainiera e Soderini, a Venetian ship capturing 2 additional Venetian ships, reached the ears of the Senate since they had last spoken, since last night? This had just come, and Wotton was attempting to convince them to take a pittance. Well, he didn't have a leg to stand on. His information was out of date. He didn't know about any of this. But the Senate, the Venetian Senate, said they knew just where Jack Ward was, and they knew where he was going to be. They hinted, much more cleverly than Wotton would ever have been able to, that this spelled the end for the arch-pirate, John Ward. The records of this encounter between Wotton and the Venetian Senate have sort of a spitting, violent quality, as if the Venetians took every word that their ambassador, Giustinian, had told them about English greed and English bribery. They had taken every bit of it, eaten it up, and they were outraged by it. They had refused to let the admiralty profit from their loss, and Henry Wotton had failed. So if the English ambassador to Venice wasn't going to get anywhere, they had to take another tack. In later November 1607, King James summoned the Venetian ambassador, Zorzi Giustinian, to a meeting. Naturally, Lord Cecil, the man who told the king that this meeting was necessary and planned it in the first place, was there, silently waiting behind the king. The letter that Giustinian would later write back to the Doge and Senate about this meeting is fascinating. Half of the letter is written in Italian. That's a language that anyone in England might be able to read. The other half, and it's not split directly in half, it'll go sentence by sentence sometimes, the other half is written in a cipher, known only to Giustinian and a few agents within the Venetian Senate. The parts written in plain Italian are, well, they're boring. Giustinian praises the English king as a wise ruler of his people, even though of course he wasn't, and in theory the king should never ever see this letter in the first place. But Giustinian knew that Cecil spoke Italian very well. So, Giustinian says that he impressed upon the king, in plain Italian, at this meeting that there was a need of any king, of any ruler, to follow their law, to keep their realm secure. This was, of course, just a random platitude that came to the mind of the Venetian ambassador that had nothing to do with the pirate Jack Ward. It would have been uncouth to discuss matters of royal policy directly with the king. So instead, he just delivered all of these vagaries about piracy. It's bad. Of course, that had nothing to do with any real pirates out there, just my thought on the pirates, And then there were suggestions, delivered much more tactfully than Wotton, even more tactfully than the Venetian Senate, but suggestions that the continuing peace and friendly relations, as well as the preferential free trade agreement between England and Venice, hinged on some of these vague platitudes about the pirates at sea. But of course, Giustinian never said any of that. The king was receptive to these arguments. Of course he was. The king was a wise ruler, didn't I say? Oh, and he's handsome too, just a dashing figure, that King James. And then Giustinian starts in with the cipher. Earlier, when he was writing back to Venice about how the king was an idiot who loved the hunt more than governance, and how he was so weak that Cecil was basically running the show, that was all in this letter, in the cipher. Giustinian said, in cipher, that after the meeting with the king, Lord Cecil pulled him aside. Cecil could be much more direct, and vice versa, about the realities about which they had been speaking almost in code. Cecil suggested that he had a personal word from Venice that the Doge and Senate intended to agree to the pardon. The word they had sent following the disastrous meeting with Wotton had been overturned. Now, of course, he had no evidence of this. You couldn't just release things like that. This was a personal word from one of his personal agents. And all of that spy versus spy, Cold War intrigue starts to seep back in. And then Cecil suggested, in fact, Cecil threatened, that the pardon was ready to go here. Everyone had agreed to it, all the lords of the admiralty, himself, the king, as well as the Venetians, remember, as he said, though he couldn't prove it. And if Giustinian refused to give his consent, if he stood against the tide, that tide would wash him away. And not only Giustinian, but the entire Venetian Republic. He promised, in a roundabout way, that the Venetian Republic would be sidelined in the world of international trade if they did not agree. This was kind of a bold assertion to make. Sure, in a few decades, England would eclipse Venice in trade almost entirely. Once sugar and slaves and overseas colonies became the name of the game, Venice really wasn't in the game anymore, not on any substantial level. They continued to be a major player in the Mediterranean, but the game had become much bigger than that. But back in 1607, England was a joke compared to Venice. It's kind of like, imagine you met a meek man named Dr. Jekyll, and you hear him making threats and giving warnings, and naturally, because he is a meek and weak little doctor, he's laughed at. But of course, with hindsight, this Dr. Jekyll would drink some serum, come back, and bludgeon everyone to death with a giant staff. But at the time, this tiny little Dr. Jekyll shouldn't have been able to do that. That would have been impossible. So Giustinian stood firm. He stuck to the plan, what his bosses in Venice had told him to do, and he refused to give any sort of consent to the most powerful and dangerous man in all of England. Giustinian said to Lord Cecil, quote, "You may imagine, then, that the Republic will never consent towards pardon. Nay, I am sure that thanks to the provision that is being made to clear the seas of this pest, Ward will too easily be wiped out." And it turned out he was right here. He just didn't exactly understand how. And that was the end of that meeting. But of course, if the first tactic hadn't worked and the second hadn't worked, the king, but actually Lord Cecil, decided to try a third. He called on Sir Henry Pepwell, that agent who had operated in Barbary, gaining all the information he could about Jack Ward, who had recently returned to England. Now, we don't know what Cecil actually told Pepwell. Possibly he just wanted to interview him about any further information that could be gleaned about the pirate before moving on with his pardon. However, ever since getting back to England, Pepwell had been sort of just sitting on his hands and biding his time while all of the diplomats were busy trying to work things out. Until after whatever happened in that meeting happened. Pepwell wrote to Ambassador Wotton in Venice and made a suggestion. He said, quote, that on the strength of his knowledge of Ward and even of a certain friendship for him, he was prepared to kill him and burn all his ships, end quote. Wotton was abashed. That talk of this sort of assassination should even cross his desk was dishonorable, downright amoral, I tell you. Remember, in my estimation, Wotton seemed to be a dull, boring, polite, and, I think, not particularly intelligent, if well-educated man. So, rebuffed again, Cecil took additional steps. He asked the Lord High Admiral to contact Giustinian. Charles Howard Effingham did so, and he was less diplomatic than Cecil had been. The Admiral met with the ambassador, ostensibly to discuss and relate news about John Ward's preparations for battle and his strength. Giustinian gives no specifics about the meeting, but apparently the admiral had access to numbers of ships and men and guns that, didn't match those in Venice. He puts it diplomatically, but says they had not yet reached Venice. It was a truly terrifying fleet. John Ward had joined forces with every corsair in the Mediterranean, apparently, and even, potentially, the entire Ottoman navy. Now, none of that was true, of course. This was bluster on the part of the admiral, and Giustinian knew it. He wrote, in the plain Italian that he suspected would be read by the English, quote, "Here they magnify Ward's preparations, and the High Admiral sent to warn me to take steps to avert the impending peril," end quote. Giustinian never outright said it. He never even said it in the cipher, and the Lord High Admiral never said it either. But there was an implication here. It was an implication that Ward was strong enough to destroy the Venetian fleet. And, digging deeper, there was an even more subtle implication that even if the Venetians defeated Ward, if Venice refused to allow this pardon to go forward, if they said no, England might just sweep in after Ward and finish the job. But of course they weren't going to say no, because of the implication. The impending peril of which the admiral spoke wasn't just Ward, though, but it was again, on another, deeper, more subtle level, it was the potential for war. However, as subtle as it was, this threat was there. That's how much the Admiralty wanted that money that John Ward possessed. But Giustinian stood firm. He informed the Lord High Admiral that Venice was more than capable of dealing with a pirate like John Ward. Remember, the ambassador, Giustinian here, had personal knowledge of both Venetian naval strength and English sea power. And his reports on Ward were at least as current as the admiral's, if not better. So Giustinian told the admiral that he could rest assured that the English pirates, offered no threat to the Venetian navy. This was a moment where they came perilously close to war, when even subtle threats of an impending peril were being made to the Venetian ambassador. Things had gone beyond serious. And In case the timeline here is a bit confusing, we've actually gone back in time a bit. I've been talking about Simon Danziger and the Charity and the Peril and their ordeal for the past several weeks now. All of that happened in the spring of 1608. All of this diplomatic wrangling was happening in the aftermath of Ward's capture of the Reiniera y Soderina, and that's in late 1607. Right now we're in early December. But as 1607 turned into 1608, things really began to heat up. There were continued meetings between Cecil, the Lord High Admiral, and Zorzi Giustinian. Giustinian was, finally, offered a bribe. He was offered a decent amount of money. Venice would receive their cut. All of the English swore upon it, and personally I believe them, but so would Zorzi. And if that wasn't enough, if this decent amount of money wasn't enough for him to potentially betray his honor, well, how about this? If Giustinian wished, he could retire to England. If the Venetians would no longer have him, King James would protect him. Giustinian would be given land, a title, a pension, and his pick of any bride in the land, well, almost any bride in the land. And remember, Zorzi, a noble bride is a wonderful thing. They come with lands and monies of their own, including a substantial dowry, should you choose wisely. Plus, they come with a full retinue of retainers. Imagine it, dozens of nubile serving girls who would certainly be enamored with their handsome new Italian lord, or, if he preferred, they could ensure that Zorzi's household staff would be stacked with young, handsome serving men known to share certain proclivities. All of them willing to do Zorzi's bidding, of course, or why not both, Giustinian? He would be a lord, and there would be nothing to stop him from enjoying all of the flavors life had to offer. And speaking of flavor, it was well known that Zorzi Giustinian didn't care much for English cuisine, but this was the Lord High Admiral talking after all. I mean, he could ensure a train of merchant ships that never stopped between England and Venice. They could pick up Spanish and Italian and French delicacies all along the way. Of course, there was one potential hiccup to that train of merchant ships. Pirates might be a problem. Of course, not if Giustinian played ball. Giustinian was not outright about all of this, but he suggested that he had been offered anything he wanted. But he refused. In one of those meetings that came a little bit later, in February of 1608, it was suggested in the letter via a cipher that the threat of impending peril had become a lot more personal. Perhaps if Giustinian was unwilling to play ball after a very reasonable offer, an accident could be arranged. The sort of accident that could never be traced back to England, but that would send a clear message. Perhaps the Venetians would be wise enough to send an ambassador who was more receptive to the English. That is how much Ward and his treasure was worth to England. Now think about that. For how many other pirates would England have gone to this level of trouble throughout their entire history? This level of trouble just to give them a pardon. They really wanted these fines paid. Who else in the entire history of English piracy was worth this level of trouble? There are a few that come to mind that would have potentially been worth it. Henry Avery, maybe, or Bartholomew Roberts. Henry Morgan, certainly, and they really kind of got that one. But would they have done all this for Blackbeard, or Vane, or Calico Jack? Of course not. That should tell us just how much John Ward was worth, not only to the English, but to the Venetians. Everybody thought in late February 1608 that they were on the verge of getting their way. Giustinian certainly thought so. Wotton was unwilling to make such a bold declaration, but Cecil and the Lord High Admiral certainly thought so. That Venetian armada was out there hunting down John Ward, or attempting to, and they certainly believed that they were hot on his trail. Everybody thought that they were going to avert war by getting exactly what they wanted. But before long, all of the threats, all of the political wrangling, all of the bribes made, all of that came to naught. Word reached Venice, and then London, that in early March of 1608, Jack Ward had set sail once again. This was the beginning of the voyage of Jack Ward that would lead into the tale of the Charity and Simon Danziger. Near the end of that leg of the voyage, I told you that Jack Ward fell off the radar. He disappeared. The Spanish, the French, the Italians, nobody knew where he had gone. And I told you that I knew where he had gone, but I would not tell you quite yet. Well, we're about to discuss that. There is one confirmable account in that leg of the voyage about Ward's whereabouts. Ward hailed a merchantman off the coast of Italy. That merchantman was captained by a man named Moore, but Moore's ship wasn't captured, just called over. Moore reported that when Captain Ward learned that this merchantman was bound for Venice, the pirate exclaimed, quote, "Tell those flatcaps who have been the occasion that I am banished out of my country, that before I have done with them, I will make them sue for my pardon." End quote. Now, this little meeting at sea between Captain Moore and Captain Ward was happening concurrent with word of Jack Ward's sailing reaching London. As in, Jack Ward went out on the account for several weeks, and word finally reached London that he had done so, and about the time it did, this meeting occurred, so they wouldn't find out about this in England for some time. But it does beg a couple of questions. How was Ward so well informed? He appeared to know that the English were willing to make this deal with him. Now, it's possible that he had received word from the English, but there had been no official declaration of an acceptance of his pardon. However, Jack Ward in this statement appears to have assumed that the English were going to let him back in. Somehow, he had received word. Whether it was from the English or from one of his spies in England, we don't know. But it also makes me wonder how he knew that the Venetians were responsible. Those flatcaps have been the occasion that I am banished out of my own country. Somehow, Jack Ward knew that the English would have let him in, and it was the Venetians that refused to allow his pardon to go forth. This suggests to me that Ward may have had spies deep in Venetian territory, deep in English territory, perhaps a vast network of spies that is greater than anything the world had yet seen out of a private pirate. He knew spectacularly fast that his old comrade, Captain Longcastle, had been executed. He knew everything spectacularly fast. It appears that in addition to Jack Ward's fleet, the Rainieri Soterina, the Ruby, the Little John, all of those ships, and in addition to the many ships that sailed under him, led by other pirate captains, there was a vast network of smaller ships, moving to and fro, smugglers really more than pirates, but smugglers of information. They were likely smugglers of real goods as well. It's probable that it was one of these crews that actually managed to get payment to Jack Ward's wife there in England, which she is reported to have received, although nobody ever proved it. In fact, if we are still working off of the assumption that that second hypothesis was correct, and Jack Ward was in fact playing a deft game about which only he knew the outcome, it appears that he was well prepared to do so. He may have been better informed than Wotton, or the Doge, or the Senate, or the King, or Cecil, or maybe even Giustinian. He may have been the best informed man in this entire drama. He may have been playing the English against the Italians the entire time for motives that we'll never understand. But it appears, if this quote can be believed, that he did legitimately want to return to England, and he was furious that Venice had refused him that right. So Jack Ward, there, after avoiding Italian detection for some weeks, he went to war. As he rounded the Italian peninsula, he avoided capturing ships of any nation except for Venice. Spanish, Genoese, Papal, Nepalese, French, all of them, he just passed them by. That was probably what saved Captain Moore and the merchantman. At that moment, Ward needed supplies, but he was willing to buy them. He didn't have the time to waste on capturing any ships that didn't belong to his now sworn enemy, Venice. There are other accounts of Jack Ward hailing ships, stopping them but not attacking them, calling them over because he needed supplies. But, of course, who's going to say no to the Rainieri Soterina, captained by the most feared pirate in the world? The reason he needed so many supplies is because of his sudden offensive. Ward captured maybe a dozen ships in a week, maybe 2. But when word reached Venice that Jack Ward was on the warpath, they scrambled their fleet. They intended to intercept Ward and to sink him to the bottom of the sea. English fleets in the region were scrambled as well. They wanted to get to Jack Ward before the Venetians were able to. They realized it was probably a fool's errand, but if they could capture him, they could still offer him the pardon, get the money, and deny Venice what they wanted. But both fleets were beaten to what they sought. On 18 March 1608, word reached England. That word had traveled fast, perhaps faster than any word had traveled to England so far. But England was still just about the last place in Europe to hear about it. This time it came from one Mario Logaletti, and it read, quote, "At Marseille there is a report spread by the men of a vessel which put in there that about 100 miles off Sergio, that's modern-day Cytherea in southern Greece, which was under Venetian control in 1608, that about 100 miles off Serigo they had fallen in with wreckage that had 4 men and a boy on it, that said they were part of the crew of a ship that had gone to the bottom because she was rotten. She was a ship taken by the corsairs from Venetians and manned in Tunis by Turks and English." End quote. The scramble to reach John Ward meant that there were agents everywhere. Pepwell was on the continent dealing with the Italians. Wotton was in Austria dealing with the Holy Roman Emperor, trying to get him to make the Venetians see reason. But in the days following the receipt of that letter by Lord Cecil, Wotton, Giustinian, Pepwell, anybody who had an interest in Jack Ward that was currently not in England was summoned to England. Along with the king and the Privy Council and a few of the higher-ups in the admiralty, this small group attended a meeting of Parliament. Now, this was still early on in the reign of King James I of England, but already he was rubbing a lot of people the wrong way, including the Parliament. There was tension there, real tension, the tension that would grow until a civil war broke out. But Jack Ward was important enough. He was big enough news that they were able to put all that aside, put aside questions of religion and taxation, because what had happened to Jack Ward was that big, not only to the people of England, but to the people of Venice, and, in a very real way, the people of continental Europe. A war between Venice and England would have been a dirty and disastrous thing, and it had gotten to the point that they were drawing up battle lines and choosing sides. However, at this meeting of the Parliament, all of that fell away. A speech was given there that read, in part, quote, "We take this occasion to inform your Excellency that we have news from Marseille that the Venetian ship Soderina, which was fitted out as a privateer by Ward, appeared off the coast of Crete, where she was sunk with her crew, including, it is supposed, Ward himself." End quote. All of the drama, everything that we have talked about today and last week, everything that occurred in England and Venice and much of it across the continent between late autumn 1607 and early spring 1608, talk of war, impending peril, murder, and bribery, all of that with this short speech fell away. The Venetians, who had been so sure that they would have their way, would get neither Ward nor their reparations. England would not receive their cut from the pirate. But there was a bright side, the tension, the threat of war. It had passed. Peace had been restored in Europe. That is, of course, until a few weeks later, when even more shocking and disastrous news arrived in London. But we're going to save that until next time. For now, at least for a while, everyone was able to get a good night's sleep. Next time, we'll tell the truth of what actually happened to Captain John Ward. The news that the captured Venetian ship Rainiera e Soderina had been lost at sea, along with her captain, sent Europe into a frenzy. John Ward was Europe's most wanted. He was a menace, a pirate. He was the pirate in the Mediterranean. Countless lives had been lost due to slavery or death on his orders. Mountains of treasure had been lost as well, not to mention the ships. If he were dead, that should be the best news anyone with an interest in Mediterranean trade had heard in some time. And yeah, for most of them, it was great news. The merchants and sailors that carried out trading voyages, for example, not to mention the investors that financed them. All of those people were pleased and relieved that John Ward was no longer a threat. But not everyone shared that sentiment. Everyone said they were greatly relieved, but the English ambassador to Venice wrote, quote, "Were to God the news were true. If it be true, this may free the seas," end quote. And that sounds kind of like relief, but it's not really. The obvious problem here is that nobody had a body. No one had a ship. Everyone seemed to be saying that John Ward was dead, and there were reports from a number of different ships from all of the Mediterranean nations that confirmed it, but still no one had any proof. So there was the question of legitimacy, and that was a big one. But then there was the question of the aftermath, of the consequences. The question of what the practical outcome of Jack Ward's sinking and dying would be. The traders and merchant companies and those investors all had a lot to lose with John Ward sailing the high seas. But in a very real way, many of the people much farther up the social ladder had a lot more to lose. That is, more to lose if Jack Ward had had his last wish fulfilled, to be buried in the sea. The crowned heads and the power brokers of Europe were gearing up for a war here. King James and Lord Cecil and the Lord High Admiral had big plans simmering there in England, and they revolved around that question of their very own homegrown arch-pirate. In Venice, the Doge and Senate were in a similar situation. They were gearing up for that conflict, and now all of that was dashed. And then France, Germany, Spain, Austria, and the Netherlands, they were all on the alert as well. They were calling up reserves. They were having discreet conversations in dimly lit hallways about who might be the smart choice when it came to allies. Venice was the obvious choice here, but remember, Europe wasn't far removed from England's miraculous victory against Spain in the Channel. England might be the underdog, but sometimes it pays to bet on the underdog. And that's really what this was all about. There was a lot of money to be made in this war. Even if you were on the losing side, it was entirely possible, through some smart diplomacy, to walk away with an acceptable peace treaty that grew your own honor, it grew your prestige and your power and your wealth. Now, one might expect Spain to side with Venice against England, but maybe not. Venice was at odds with Rome at the moment, and the Pope might not look too kindly on either Spain or the Holy Roman Empire siding with them. England was, in many ways, a much better choice, despite their recent enmity. King James was rumored to hold a certain sympathy for the Catholic faith and the Catholic people. Perhaps he would make a very good ally. Really, though, it all depended on what France decided to do. That's what they always did here anyway. France and the Habsburgs would be at odds in this war as they were in nearly every war. They could fight over their shared border and contested territories in the lowlands again. And it was about time Europe had a good old-fashioned war. It had been a few years, and there were a few new monarchs sitting on the thrones. And there were a lot of lingering questions about religion and succession and colonial holdings. It was really a perfect time for war. Perhaps the only monarch in the European sphere, or, council or senate or whatever, but perhaps the only one who was genuinely relieved to hear that Ward was dead was the Ottoman Sultan. The Venetian ambassador in Istanbul wrote the Doge inquiring about the fate of Ward. The Sultan was deeply concerned about an impending war based upon pirates operating out of lands that he still technically ruled. Without question, Istanbul would certainly be roped into all of this, and currently they were fairly weak, at least at sea. The loss of Tunis was likely, maybe even Tripoli, or maybe even Algiers. The loss of the whole of Barbary might just be imminent. But if John Ward was dead, he was off the hook here. So that one question lay on the lips of everyone in Europe, from King John and Lord Cecil to the Doge and the Senate, from the Pope in Rome to Madrid to Paris to Vienna. Was John Ward really dead? This is episode 93, Bound to a Dead Man's Back. I've been dancing around that question for weeks now, talking about all of the players and ambassadors and nations and the other pirates that had a very real interest in the fate of John Ward. Many of you have probably already figured out something of the truth here, but no one in Europe had that kind of insight. All they had were the rumors passed on by sailors that talked to other sailors that claimed to have seen something. Now there were enough of them that a pattern seemed to be forming. Say you were in charge of planning for the upcoming war, and you repeatedly heard that the cause for that war was currently somewhere at the bottom of the sea. You might just think about putting those preparations on hold. War could be very profitable, but it was still expensive. And if the war wasn't going to happen, all of that expense would just be a waste. So most of those in power started quietly putting their armies away. But two nations were already too far along in their plans and preparations for any of that. England and Venice were at the heart of this conflict, and they both had substantial interest in it. For them, it was more than just a few potential territorial gains. It was more than the promise of sharpening their claws and terrorizing a few peasants and raiding some coffers. They had real stakes in the game. For England, those were twofold. They really wanted all of that money that was supposed to come with the pardon of John Ward, especially the admiralty. Cecil and James were much more interested in securing a dominant place in Mediterranean trade, but that made them no less interested in this war. In a lot of ways, England was forged and tested in this Anglo-Spanish War under Elizabeth, and now many of the men who fought that war wanted to put some of that experience to use. To that end, supplanting the Venetians was a good geopolitical strategy. Plus, it really was a good time for war. For much of Europe, it had been some time, and they had plenty of men ready to go die on a distant battlefield. And then the rift between Venice and the Pope, well, that could change the power structure in Europe significantly, involving Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, the entire Habsburg dynasty. But all of that informed a bigger question. Could King James potentially smooth over some of those old enmities that Queen Elizabeth had left behind? Could James put England on a peaceful footing, or maybe even a friendly footing, with Catholic Europe? That would be a major upset, and it would secure the Stuart dynasty a lot of powerful friends in Europe. And as we know from later events, that's something that he would have been happy to do. But Venice was facing that same question from the other side. If England did manage to secure those alliances, or even promises of peace from some of their old enemies, Venice might fall squarely in their crosshairs. England might actually be able to make good on the threat that Lord Cecil made towards Zorzi Giustinian. They might actually be able to push Venice into the periphery. They might be able to supplant Venice's place in the Mediterranean. They had the ships to do it, and with the blessing of the Pope, they would have the friends to do it. But then there were the bigger, more ethereal questions. Honor and duty. The Venetians had been shamed by English pirates over and over and over, and then they were insulted by English officials when they looked for their proper retribution, and that was an insult that required an answer. And what about their losses? I mean, there were ships and treasure, and all that was important, but what about the people? How many Venetians had these pirates killed? How many untold thousands were currently enslaved somewhere in Barbary, working as laborers or concubines? And even if they couldn't be rescued, Venice had the opportunity here to deal such a blow that no one else might suffer that fate. They would begin with the pirates of Barbary, but they would move on to anyone who dared interfere with that justice, including the English. So, England and Venice both needed to know. They needed to know if there were any truth to the rumors of John Ward's death. The most reliable account came out of France via Marseille. An Italian ship's captain claimed to have picked up 4 sailors, 3 men and 1 boy. When those sailors were found, they were clinging to the floating debris of what had once been a ship. There had been a storm a day or so ago, but these castaways were clearly corsairs. The real bombshell, though, was dropped when they told the captain of that Italian vessel that they had been sailors aboard the Rainiera e Sodarina. That was the most infamous ship in the Mediterranean, perhaps the most infamous ship everywhere, and it was helmed by the most feared pirate in the entire world. If these corsairs were to be believed, that ship was currently lying on the seabed off the coast of Greece. Their story was confused, though. They couldn't keep it straight. Each of the men had a different version of the story to tell. It was a sudden squall that sank them. No, it was an ambush that did them in. No, wait, it was a mutiny. Had the English authorities been given the chance to interrogate these men, they may have been able to smuggle out a nugget of truth. But that was impossible. After their rescue, these pirates disappeared. No one knew where they had gone. One can presume that they jumped ship in Marseille or maybe stole a boat, but nobody knows. I can't actually verify that these Barbary corsairs ever even existed. We have only the single account of these men in particular. But try to look at that tale from the point of view of the English. An English ship arrives in London, bearing the testimony of an Italian captain that he met somewhere in southern France. That Italian captain told a tale of shipwreck and death that could not be verified, and then there were at least 3 versions of that tale. Would you believe that? When the Venetians, who were themselves Italian, remember, had so much writing on denying John Ward to the English government, would you believe that Ward just sank somewhere in Greece? And remember, the region of Greece in which John Ward allegedly sank was currently under the occupation of the Republic of Venice. So isn't that all just a little bit suspect? But here's the rub. It was true. At least, it's generally agreed today that there is some truth in the account of these 4 sailors. It's still virtually impossible to verify, but later evidence would come to light that supports it a bit. But that's with hindsight. And in 1608, the English didn't have that luxury. And neither did Venice. They were suspicious of this story as well. Who's to say that Italian captain wasn't paid off to spin this tale? Who's to say that the English didn't send a squadron of ships to Tunis to pick Ward up, then create an elaborate ruse of this supposed shipwreck? They could sneak Ward and his men back to England, collect the hefty fine that Ward had already agreed to pay, and then set him free. Now that might sound a little far-fetched, but I didn't just make that up. That was the firmly held opinion of one Venetian in particular, Zorzi Giustinian, the ambassador to England. As we discussed last time, Zorzi Giustinian deeply distrusted the English people and their officials. He considered the English to be corrupt and pirate sympathizers. And, he wasn't really wrong about that. Corruption was rampant in England. And some within the government, nearly everybody within the admiralty, was very invested in pardoning Ward to secure some of his plunder. But then again, Giustinian only had a passing familiarity with the truth. He was prone to conspiracy theories and jumped to a lot of conclusions. Sometimes those conclusions worked in his favor, but not always, not even most of the time. A good spy should suspect everyone and everything until proven otherwise. Every parcel of information should be examined and dissected from every angle before being believed. And Giustinian had that down most of the time, but then a good spy should also hold their own conclusions to the same standard. They should be examined and dissected before being agreed to, even in your own mind. And that's something that Zorzi Giustinian did not do. When word came to England that John Ward was rumored dead, Giustinian dismissed it immediately. He wrote, quote, "At court this morning I found a rumor that Ward and his ship had been wrecked and lost. Some say that this rumor was set about on purpose by the merchants interested in the goods." End quote. The goods in question were, some of them were probably the goods that arrived in England a few months earlier that Ward had pillaged from the Rainiera y Sodorina. They were currently locked up in London, and with Ward dead, they would go up for auction. But also the money that was involved if the English had created this elaborate ruse. Now, on face value, that's a good instinct for a spy. Suspect, distrust, and question everything. But he allowed the rumor spoken by some elusive people to shape his opinion. This worked for Giustinian. It allowed this new development to fall into his predetermined conclusion. But his masters in Venice saw his mistake immediately. They were receiving up-to-the-minute information with every ship that came in, and as the evidence piled up and piled up and piled up, it really did appear that the tale was true. The Rainiere Sotorina had wrecked off the coast of Greece, and nearly every soul on board had been lost. Except for those 4 survivors, that's almost 350 pirates. And that made Zorzi Giustinian look terribly foolish, but it did serve to lessen the tension between England and Venice. Now, the English didn't believe the Venetian reports, but they had their own agents looking into it, and they brought back similar conclusions. The ship did appear to be long gone, as did Ward. For now, the threat of war was well and truly averted. And that's generally a good thing, but in this case, with the ability to look back on things, it really might not have been. Now, this is a big what if, and all of it is coming from me, so take it all with a grain of salt. But there hadn't been a good general European war for a while now. We're only 5 years removed from the end of the Anglo-Spanish War, but that was mostly a naval war, and much of it was fought in the West Indies. The Dutch and the Portuguese were currently embroiled in a war, and that would last decades, but again, that was mostly a naval war that took place mostly in the East Indies. The Ottomans and the Holy Roman Empire had a conflict over in Wallachia, and then there were a few rebellions and dynastic struggles, but those were all internal wars. And there were some close calls, much like this conflict that almost erupted between England and Venice, but nothing that came to pass. However, this is 1608. We're only 10 years out from one of the most destructive wars that Europe had ever seen. In 1618, Europe was going to explode into the 30 Years' War. Now, there are a lot of causes that one can point to for the 30 Years' War. Religious strife and economic equality, territorial disputes, and everyone in Europe generally hating the Habsburgs, even other Habsburgs. Those seem to be the big ones. And then there were the smaller wars that were roped under the umbrella of the 30 Years' War. Spain, France, and the Netherlands would fight over that piece of ground that they had been for centuries and would continue to for more centuries. Denmark and Sweden would have a war up north, and a lot of colonies would join in the fray, but close to home. This was a big war. Many consider it the First World War, although one has to perhaps stretch your definition a little bit. Hundreds and thousands of people would die. More than 200,000 soldiers at the least would die due to fighting, probably more. But then there were the common people that died due to famine or plague or witch hunts. Everything that was there to cause this war was already there in 1608. Nearly everything, at least the big power politics and religion stuff. But maybe, had a general European war broken out over the conflict between Venice and England, those tensions would have been a bit less pronounced. Maybe the war would have been less terrible. If some of the pressure had been released in 1608, it's possible that a lot of questions would have been answered in less terrible ways. Now, they may have had to have another war in 1618, but if many of the problems had been solved a decade earlier, it might not have been as bad. Or, maybe not. Maybe this war in 1608 would have been a small, quick naval engagement in the Mediterranean. After all, it was only about 2 countries arguing over a pirate and vying for slightly better positions in trade. But I do wonder what might have been. But in the end, it's a pointless question. War didn't break out. Everyone put their guns away. The cause of the war, at least the stated cause of the war, was dead and rotting somewhere in the Mediterranean. Only John Ward was neither dead nor rotting. I wish I could tell you that everything here was all an elaborate ruse on the part of John Ward, that he was actually waiting somewhere in the Mediterranean on board the Rainiere Sotorina to pounce on, whoever, probably Venice. But I can't. Rainiere Sotorina was, in fact, sunk and destroyed. There was a storm out there off the coast of Greece, and the greatest pirate ship Barbary had ever seen was gone. But John Ward survived. How he survived, though, is the big question. The writers and storytellers and pamphleteers, in London mostly, all tend to agree on one narrative. It's a compelling story, and there's probably some truth in it, but it's also steeped in the sort of religious symbolism that the clergy would approve of. They tell us that Jack Ward was puffed up with pride over his big new warship, Andrew Barker tells us, quote, "His mind was so inflated with pride and puffed up with vainglory that he now thought he was the sole and only commander of the seas." And then he goes on, quote, "He was lying in wait for more booty. It pleased God to prevent them by a storm that arose, in which the great Argosy sunk suddenly, and all the men in her being drowned, save only 4. End quote. But they paint Ward as this foul, devilish creature who slipped away at just the right moment to avoid the storm and God's wrath. And there are nuggets of truth in there, but not the whole truth. The investigators that would later on be sent to Barbary to look into the events surrounding the shipwreck, along with historians, have pieced together a much more plausible account of what actually happened out there. What we know looks like this. Ward sailed from Tunis aboard his refitted Rainiera y Soterina in late 1607. She'd been stripped of all of her excess weight and had a couple of dozen new guns installed, including gun ports. Ward sailed out with a fleet, including Ruby and Little John and all of the ships that he personally owned, and then there were a number of pirates sailing their own vessels sailing along with her, men like Captain Foxley and Francis Verney. That fleet sailed for the coast of France, and that was where John Ward turned around and left everyone but Ruby and Little John behind. The rest of the fleet headed towards Spain and the Balearic Islands, where they terrorized the Charity and the Peril, and you know that whole story. But what we know about Ward here is limited. I mentioned the English merchantman that Ward hailed over near Naples. The captain reported there that Ward cursed the Venetian flatcaps and swore death and vengeance on them. And that's really the only account we have of Ward happening concurrent to the events closer to Spain, until he begins to dole out that death and vengeance. It's plausible that John Ward heard about the Venetian ploy to block his impending pardon somewhere off the coast of France. He had spies and agents all across Europe, certainly in Marseille, so one of those spies probably brought him the news about his pardon being blocked by Venice, and that's what set him off on his revenge crusade. He sailed for Venetian Greece and began taking every ship he could. He took a number of them in very quick succession. That was when Venice began to prepare their fleet. They were ready to send out their ships and destroy John Ward, but then that storm caught the Rainiera y Soterina and sank her. Now why did she sink? The generally accepted story is that all of the new gun ports that Jack Ward had cut into the hull weakened it. He had turned her cargo deck, her upper cargo deck, into a gun deck. He may have overdone it here. And then there's a question about the state of the hull outside of the gun ports. Those 4 sailors said that the Soterina was rotting. That seems like a bit of a stretch to me, though. Remember, John Ward was an old sailor. He grew up a fisherman, and then a privateer, and then a Navy man, and now a pirate. Would he allow his baby, this pride and joy with which he was puffed up in vainglory, to fall into such disrepair? Would the Venetians allow one of their great Argosy to fall into disrepair? I don't think so on either count, but that's the story we have, so we have to accept it and work from it. But those sailors had other claims to make. We had 3 different stories from 3 different people. That it was either the storm that sank them, or an ambush, or a mutiny. We could extrapolate what might have happened here. We can use those 3 stories, along with the reports of contemporary agents, the English writers later on, and what modern historians have concluded. Now I say what might have happened because, well, what I'm going to do here is stitch together a possible narrative, my own possible narrative. It's going to fit all of the evidence, but it's also going to build from it. It will weave a number of different conclusions reached by different agents into one story. Now, the Soterina was carrying around 350... Well, it's commonly reported that she sank with 350 men on board, but upon leaving the port at Tunis, she was carrying 350... Well, Turks is probably the best word here. There were Berbers and Jews and Turkish people and Armenian and Greeks all in that lot, all of them Muslim, including the Janissary contingent. Now, there's no easy shorthand here, and I don't want to call them Turks, so moving on, when I say Muslim, I mean that ethnic and national and religious blend right there. When I say European moving forward, I'm referring to the Western European pirates, English, Italian, and Dutch mostly. There were 40 or 50 Europeans on board the Rainiera y Sodorina, in addition to the 350 Muslims. And I'm aware that the umbrella of Europeans should include the Greeks and Armenians and maybe the Turks, but I can't call these men Christians because, well, we'll discuss that next time. The Europeans on board Rainiera y Sodorina comprised a sort of elite officer class among the crew. The Janissary were sort of their own thing. They had their own position of power as representatives of the day back in Tunis, but the rest of the crew, the Muslim majority, were sort of second-class crewmen. See, Ward didn't subscribe to the later piratical ideas of equality among the crew, or that almost democratic system that would be a cornerstone of pirates and piracy. His ship, his fleet, was delegated into more traditional power roles, similar to the English Navy. The Europeans, in this case, were the officers, and the Muslims were the regular crew. Now, Ward was, well, he was responsible for a lot of firsts in the pirate world. For example, he was among the first pirates to adopt that practice of electing a captain. But his shipboard democracy apparently ended there. His idea of the captain's role was much different from later pirates and much more similar to the English Navy. The captain, Jack Ward in this case, appointed all of the officers himself and made all of the rules. As you can imagine, the majority Muslim corsairs here weren't too happy with that arrangement. They were forced into subservient roles, and on board Rainiera y Sodorina, on this, her first voyage as a pirate ship, there were a lot more of them than there had been before. They were recruited in large numbers to flesh out the crew of the ship. So there wound up being a number of squabbles between the crewmen and the officers. Sometimes those broke down into brawls, and occasionally murder. Barker tells us of Jack Ward's rules, quote, "His laws were that in several places in his ships there should be wine sold, as there is in taverns. But with this law, which himself he made, if any one in his drunkenness or otherwise falling out should kill or stab any man, he should be presently bound to the dead man's back and cast into the sea." End quote. Now, outright murder was always punished harshly on pirate ships. It had to be, or else things would break down into chaos and disorder. But there's a big difference here. On later pirate vessels, the accused had the opportunity to tell their side of the story. You know, a pirate might be found standing above a corpse on deck, even with the murder weapon in hand, dripping blood. Obviously, they killed the deceased here, but they would have the chance to explain why they did it. Was it self-defense? Was there a debt involved, or maybe theft? Early in her career, Anne Bonny had to kill more than a few pirates who sought to take advantage of her. Everyone learned better very quickly, of course, but Anne Bonny never faced punishment for it. That was obviously a case of self-defense. But all of the other factors were taken into account as well, things like theft or debt. Now, if that were the case, the perpetrator wouldn't get off scot-free, but they might face a beating or limited rations or something to that effect. But here's the thing. The killer was allowed to tell their story to the crew, and the crew decided their fate, usually at least. It was the crew that decided the guilt or innocence of the accused, and then they followed the rules set down in a code that everyone had already agreed to. That's how it worked later on, usually. But on this voyage of Jack Ward, when tensions between the Europeans and the Barbary natives were running high, the captain personally set down judgment and punishment. Now, we don't have a lot of details, but there was at least one killing on board the Rainiera y Sodorina. That's why we know about Ward's policy toward murder. A Muslim sailor murdered a European officer, and Ward decreed that that murderer be strapped to the deceased man's body and thrown overboard. His hands were bound to the dead man. He was unable to swim. He was strapped to a stone. That stone was dragging the man down to the bottom of the sea. I think he may almost have hoped that a shark would come along and finish the job quickly. But we don't know why that sailor killed that officer. Maybe it was an unfair punishment. Maybe it was theft or self-defense. But it didn't matter. That sailor didn't get the chance to tell his story. Ward made his decree and the punishment was carried out. This made the tension on board Rainiera y Sodorina even worse. Things began to boil over. It was clear that Ward was losing control of the crew here. And here we're going to find our first major divergence in the story. See, Ward might have been on board the Rainiera y Sodorina the entire time. He was the admiral of the fleet, and it was a very big ship, should be his flagship, maybe. But the ship did have another captain, William Graves, Bill Graves. And God, that's a great pirate name. Bill Graves was Ward's first mate early on. He was the pirate that told Ward that one day he would kill him, and God would send down an angel to bring him directly to heaven for doing the world such a good service. Now, I dispute the legitimacy of that story, but Graves was the master of Rainiera y Sodorina here. Now, Ward, serving as admiral, may have been on board alongside him. That's what the English tell us, but the Venetians have another version of the story. They say that John Ward was admiral of the fleet from on board the Little John. They tell us that when that officer was killed on board the Sodorina, Ward came over to dole out his judgment, or perhaps he came out after the judgment had been handed down to quell the growing threat of mutiny on board his big ship. Either way, according to the Venetian version of the story, Ward came over to deal with some problems and then went back to his ship, Little John. Now, in normal times, that wouldn't be such a big distinction, except for the fact that the Rainiera y Sodorina was about to sink with 350 men on board. The English, who tell us that Ward sailed on the Sodorina most of the time, paint their arch-pirate as a terrible villain who abandoned his rotten, leaky ship right before a big storm and heartlessly let 350 men die. They think that he abandoned ship for the Little John and just let fate take its course, which is a commonly accepted version of the story. You could use that in your term paper and be fine. But I think things went a little bit differently than that. Personally, I agree with the Venetian view here. I think Ward was captain of the Little John with Bill Graves on board the Sodorina. I think that Ward came over to Graves' ship to deal with the murder and to pass judgment on the killer, to tie him to a corpse and toss him overboard. But it was probably even before the man was thrown overboard that the tension that had been bubbling, the potential mutiny, began to break free. I imagine the crew milling about uneasily when the judgment was passed, grumbling. And then, when they found out what the punishment was to be, I imagine open anger, I imagine shouting and protests. But Ward was still that larger-than-life figure. He was their admiral, and he was a personal friend of the day back in Tunis. And I wonder who the Janissaries would have sided with here. Would they back their brothers in Islam, or would they back the man that, frankly, made them very, very rich? Remember, Ward was the de facto vice-treasurer of Tunis. He brought in huge amounts of plunder, and he shared it with the Dey, who then shared it with the Janissary. So, they very well may have sided with Jack Ward and tried to quell any violence that appeared to be breaking free. And perhaps it came to that. Perhaps the crew began to draw swords and line up for battle. Perhaps the English did the same, although there were many, many fewer of them. But then maybe the Janissary stepped in to calm everyone down. And what comes next is where my narrative, my personal story here, starts to truly deviate from any other historical accounts. But it does work with the stories told by those pirates who would be rescued a few days later. Just keep in mind that this is my speculation. So things clearly weren't going well between the Muslim crewmen and the Europeans. Why not offer up a solution? Were I in Ward's shoes here, I might come up with something kind of like this. The Rainiera y Sodorina was a large ship. That's why there were so many new Muslim faces on board. Since there were conflicts with the Europeans, who were the officers on board, why not just give command of the Sodorina over to the Muslim corsairs? Now, the Little John was pretty full, but if Ward were to, say, send the Janissary warriors from Little John on over to the Sodorina, that would free up plenty of room for Captain Bill Graves and all of the European officers to come aboard Little John. The Janissary, who had a position of power in the fleet anyway, could choose their own command structure aboard the Sodorina. They could choose their own officers, or make it democratic rule, however they wanted to do things. Now, they would still be in Ward's fleet, obviously. That's not going to change, but Ward did magnanimously grant them the right to make their own rules and to enforce them how they saw fit. Now, if this actually did happen, and no one is saying it did but me, but if it did, it would have been an elegant solution. It would keep the Sodorina sailing with a competent crew and commanders, and it would keep her in the fleet of Jack Ward. Now, whether or not that did happen, it was around that time that Jack Ward, and we do know this, left the leaky, rotten giant behind, along with Bill Graves and the other Europeans, and boarded Little John. Now, this might just be good timing on the part of Jack Ward. He may have suspected that his big ship might sink in the upcoming storm. Or maybe there was something more nefarious going on. I mean, that's nefarious enough to leave 350 men to die. But what if all three of the tales shared by those rescued corsairs turned out to be true? Maybe not the whole truth, but a part of it. There was a storm, that much is verifiable, but what if there was also a mutiny? And what if there was also an ambush lying in wait? Imagine, and I may be giving John Ward more credit than he deserves here, but imagine that he took his European crew back to Little John. Then he ordered the fleet to wait offshore while the storm passed. This was normal procedure. You didn't want to be tied down through a storm. But when night fell, maybe Jack Ward sent over a boat or two of experienced killers to do exactly what they were best at. Or maybe he had a few men on the inside, perhaps some of the Janissary who had significantly more loyalty to him than their brothers in Islam. Maybe they crept aboard the Rainiera y Sodorina under cover of nightfall and rainfall. Most of the crew would have been hunkered down in their cabins or asleep. Maybe they killed the watchman. Maybe they sliced a few key lines to disable the sails, or maybe they damaged the wheel. Imagine that small group of hardened killers sneaking into the quiet parts of the ship. Maybe they lit a few fires, maybe in the magazine. And then maybe they made their way back to Little John, or it's possible that they stuck around and hid somewhere on board. After an agreed-upon time, that's when Ruby and Little John crept in on either side of Rainiera y Sodorina and opened fire. Imagine a ship filled with sailors preparing to weather out a storm. They were being tossed about by sudden winds and sudden waves, and then all of a sudden, coming under fire from both sides. Imagine their surprise when they rushed to the deck to find that all of the lines had been cut, or maybe the wheel didn't work, they were unable to maneuver. Imagine the shock they felt when they found their leaders on board with throats cut open. And imagine the panic that would have engulfed the men when they rallied to fire back on these two ships that were attacking them, and a party of their former comrades burst out to cut them down where they stood. Try to picture being on that deck, fighting for your life with cannonballs flying and wood shattering and men screaming as the storm picks up strength and batters you with rain and throws you about the deck. Your friends are tossed overboard. Some of your former friends are slicing open their throats. And then someone yells over the din of battle and the storm that the ship is sinking. You can't get to the boats. You can get to them, but you can't take them down to the water because Ward would blow you out of it. But you can't stay here. When the ship goes down, and she is most certainly going down, everything around her is going to be taken down with it. Imagine diving overboard through the smoke and through a film of blood into the turbulent waters with the sinking ship pulling at you from behind. Imagine, in that situation, finding a piece of flotsam and clinging on for dear life. Imagine waiting out the storm and the battle and the sinking ship with only a piece of wood keeping you afloat and alive. Imagine dealing with that for an entire night. And then dawn comes. Maybe you have to take a deep breath and slip under the water to avoid notice when Ruby comes close. That's a dramatic representation of something that might have happened. However, 4 crewmen and 1 boy may have experienced something like that. At the very least, we can say that Ward did leave Rainiera y Sodorina shortly before the storm, possibly knowing that she was going to sink. All of the blood in the battle may not have happened here. That's my invention, working from the stories of 3 anonymous Barbary pirates who may not have existed according to an Englishman who heard it from an Italian, neither of whom were actually there. But the turbulent seas, the sinking ship, and the clinging on for dear life did happen to many men, and only 4 survived. Around 350 pirates and janissaries lost their lives in this disaster. Even if Jack Ward didn't treacherously abandon ship and attack her in the night, he did abandon those men to die. And somehow that's almost worse. I mean, if he were a pirate admiral attacking a mutinous crew, there's some sort of valor to be found in that, even if he did so with trickery and ambush. But if he just realized that his ship was sinking and decided to slip away, if he just left his men to die while he sailed safely toward the horizon, I mean, there's no valor in that. There's no excuse for that. That would make John Ward nothing but a coward. And maybe that's all he was. That's the story that the English tell us after all. Whatever the truth here was, John Ward wasn't going to walk away from the loss of his flagship, the loss of Rainiera y Sodorina, unscathed. In terms of strength, losing his biggest ship and 350 men, well, it weakened him. Many of his allies left him and sailed off for Algiers to sail under Simon Danziger. And now that, at the end of his voyage, he had no pardon to look forward to, he didn't really have any choice but to slink back to Tunis. And Tunis was a city filled with the family and friends of the men who had just died, men who Jack Ward had failed to bring back safely. Many of those family and friends blamed him personally. He was going to suffer through that blame, but when he did return, he discovered the worst news yet, at least for him personally. The day his strongest ally had died. Next time, we're going to follow Jack Ward to Tunis and discuss everything that he faced. We're going to discuss how he coped with the new reality in which he found himself, and then, at long last, we are going to discuss the end of the arch-pirate Jack Ward. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everyone who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon, everybody who has suggested this show, either in real life or on social media, everybody who has left us a rating or a review wherever it is you listen to the show. Without all of you, I wouldn't be able to do this, so thank you.